So I would like to welcome on the stage our four speakers that I would like to thank really to have accepted to be there. So Nancy, Paola, David, and Luben, please join here. So basically this will be a roundtable with four stakeholders. Of course, we have prepared a series of questions to them, but the idea is, of course, to have something interactive here. So you have to feel free. Please sit wherever you want. I will introduce you, and I'm just explaining quickly. Perhaps we don't need that. I don't know whether we have some slide to put or something. So basically, we have Nancy de Bruyn, who studied veterinary medicine in Ghent, and after working as a vet practitioner in Belgium and the UK, she works since 2000 for the FVE, and she's being currently the executive director of FVE. In respect to medicine, she published papers on antimicrobials, antibiotic sensitivity testing, and adverse events of medicines. She has been member of the management board of European representing the vet profession for 6 years, and she's also the diplomate of the European College of Animal Welfare and Behavioral Medicine, subspecialty Animal Welfare Science, Ethics and Law, and is a member of the EU Platform of Animal Welfare. Paola is a Spanish veterinarian, licensed in Madrid University, and she specialized in equine physiotherapy and rehabilitation and animal production and health, and she's currently working as a policy advisor in Brussels for EU farmers and agricultural cooperatives in Copa Cogeca. We also have David John, who moved to Brussels in 2011 to join the technical group of Animal Health Europe, and he's the currently senior technical manager responsible for immunological and alternatives to antimicrobials. Prior to joining Animal Health Europe, he spent many years working for Covance, initially responsible for conducting livestock metabolism and residue studies, before moving to ecotoxicology to conduct both aquatic and terrestrial studies, and he graduated in agricultural chemistry from Leeds University. And Luben Goranov is a policy officer in the unit D4 for veterinary medicines of DG Health and Food Safety, so DG Santé of the European Commission. And this unit deals with the development and implementation of policies and legislation relating to the authorization and use of veterinary medicinal products in the EU. Luben has completed a master's in veterinary medicine in 2000, and he also got a master's degree in biodiversity conservation and management from the University of Oxford. Luben has worked as a practicing veterinarian and a medical translator and interpreter in Bulgaria, and since 2012, Luben started his career in the European institutions in the European Parliament before joining the European Commission in 2018. So we have about an hour here. As you know, I will try to divide basically this time in 3 major themes, which mostly relate basically to the first presentation. So we will be trying to talk about farmers and changing practices, veterinarians and the development of preventive approaches to animal health, and as well the main systemic lock-ins and of the antimicrobial decision system, as we call it, and how basically to overcome them. So as I said, I'm the master of time here. Let's try to dedicate about 15-20 minutes per theme. I have a series of questions that we will to basically break the ice and launch the conversations. But really, I would really like the audience as well. If you have questions to our stakeholders here, feel free to intervene, raise your hand, and so on. I don't know if we have a second mic for the room, or is it the only one that is here? If so, I may just sit here and let the mic for the room. I don't know. Yes. Could you handle the mic then? Yes. Thank you very much, Norali.
I will get some steps in today. I'll be here.
Yeah, so as you, and yes, just to clarify again the organization here, as I said, we will be mostly talking about things that have been presented in the first presentation, while basically there will be a second roundtable with our scientific advisory board members later in the day. Actually, this is last session of the day, where basically we will reproduce more or less the same organization, and Living Labs will be really at the heart of this second roundtable. But if you have questions, of course, or if you want to, I'm talking here to our speakers to also say things about what you just heard, of course, feel free to do so. So, first of all, I mean, as I said, we're very happy to have you here, because you are basically a point of view on what we've done and all the issues that have been basically stressed during the whole morning. It matters a lot to us. And so first of all, we wanted to know how you perceive this very important aspect of changing farming practices, and how, according to what you do in your organization and so on, how do you see the question of motivating and supporting farmers to change? What are, according to you, the main trigger point for action, and also how perhaps to include other actors in this kind of process? That has been a topic that has been a little bit addressed in some questions earlier, but how to push also the stakeholders in general to support farmers towards the necessary transitions. So I don't know who would like to start with that, but yeah, please. Yes, yeah, I was kind of expecting you to answer, but yeah.
Should I? Yeah. Thank you very much. Good morning, almost afternoon. For everyone, I'm very happy to be here. As Nicola was mentioning, I'm Paula de Vera. I represent Copa Cogeca, who is the umbrella organization for farmers and cooperatives of the European Union. Just for you to have some numbers, we represent 22,000 cooperatives and 22 million of family members, let's say. In the whole, for the moment in the EU26, we are still missing Bulgaria as a member, but for the rest of the member states we have, that will come at some point, that's for sure. So answering the question, I think we should put maybe some basic principles on the table, first of all, that I think will be useful for the whole hour of discussion. First of all, well, of course, farmers, one of our first aims is to produce sustainable, healthy livestock production. Secondly, we are very aware and very compromised, very committed, let's say, to the concept of One Health. So we understand that every part of the health is environment, human, animal. It's related, so that should always be taken into account. And the third one thing that I'm sure that this project and other related projects, for instance, Project Disarm, that Copa Cogeca was directly involved, and that finished last year, we are very aware of, is the principles of prevention. Prevention is better than cure, and as less as possible, as much as necessary. So coming from that basis, and directly on the question, I will just maybe tackle the question. I mean, we are saying how to motivate farmers to change, but we need to first acknowledge that farmers have been already evolving and changing for decades. Let's say at the same time that science advances and technologies advance, now it's even quicker than before. But we can consider that in the last 4-5 decades, and particularly in the last 2, we have seen quite an improvement and development of the farming technologies, and a willingness of farmers to increase awareness among themselves, among their workers, but also among consumers on how animals are produced, and the high standards that we have, of course, following EU legislation. So I will change the question on how can we better perform, or how can we advance. And I think you mentioned that one of the main things that it's crucial, and we in Brussels, we know that. I see a lot of familiar faces in the room. And I will mention a platform. Yeah, that's my bag, sorry. She was a bit tired, it's almost lunchtime. Anyway, so yeah, it's the EPRUMA platform, the European Platform for Responsible Use of Medicines in Animals, of which FE, for instance, FEFAC, Copa Cogeca, Animal Health Europe, and I'm not sure if anyone else from the room, I don't see any other faces, but other also national organizations are part, that we commit together as industry, veterinarians, farmers, to achieve this goal of having the best and more sustainable and targeted, let's say, protection of our animals. So that's why we exchange a lot of knowledge, and I think that's one of the starting points that we need to consider, the collaboration and the communication, and being able to transmit that as well to consumers and citizens. So I think, yeah, that will be my general answer to set a little bit the debate. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Paul has said a lot on what it is, but I think the other thing it's very important we've touched on earlier is farming is facing a lot of pressures, economic, environmental, we've heard of the nitrate, biodiversity, what consumers are willing to pay for the product. So I think it is important that any solutions in terms of AMU reduction that we put forward are at the very least compatible with solutions to the other problems and hopefully synergistic. Because if it isn't at least compatible, we're going to really struggle.
So what I would like to add to this is indeed solutions which cater for all aspects are needed, even though I come here with a disclaimer that I only represent in a way the small section of the Commission which works with setting the policy and legislation and implementing legislation which concerns the authorization and use of veterinary medicinal products. But I think that links basically even to the first slide shown today that, okay, I see here a very motivated team to actually come together, achieve further reductions in the use of antimicrobials throughout the EU, but the overarching thing is actually the structure and the rules by which everybody plays. So that's what we basically do in the Commission in our unit. I guess most of you are aware of the new regulation on VMPs, which became applicable last year. I don't know, I didn't get the chance to actually ask some of the people who worked on all these projects whether they saw some form of change in behavior since the last, basically in the last year and couple of months. But indeed, what is most important in a way is setting the rules of the game, and that's what our regulation does. It sets a number of restrictions on the use of antimicrobials in order to ensure prudent and responsible use. You are probably very well aware of the ban to use antimicrobials for growth promotion, for yield increase, also various restrictions on the prophylactic and metaphylactic use of antimicrobials. There's also the list of antimicrobials which are off limits for veterinary use in order to preserve their efficacy for humans. And very important as well is basically the collection of data on the sales and use of antimicrobials throughout the EU, because that is what will actually guide the whole process, because what we are aiming for, you're probably also well aware of the European Green Deal and Farm to Fork strategy, which sets an overall EU objective of reducing the sales of antimicrobials in farming and in aquaculture by 50% by 2030. So all these measures that are contained in our regulation and the data collection will in a way guide that process, but bringing us also to the question, how do we involve other actors? That will also allow the member states, which are more or less responsible for implementing the regulation on the ground, to see the trends and basically adapt their measures in a more targeted way and helping where needed their farmers to actually achieve that overall objective of reduction of antimicrobial use throughout the EU.
Yeah, just this last one to add up a little bit to what was said already. First of all, how do we motivate and support farmers to change? I completely underline the first thing that was said. The farming profession already changed a lot. We see the same in the veterinary profession. There has been already a lot of change. We reduced now almost 50% of antimicrobial use in sales. that we know in Europe. So there has already been done a lot. So how can we further motivate? Well, I completely agree with the solution that there's no one solution. There's no single miracle solution. If there was, we wouldn't be sitting here today. We can all go home. And so there has to be a combination of all possible measures. And there indeed, measuring, I think, plays an enormous importance role. That's also how we've seen that now we have made this reduction, and now if we start to measure on use data, also on species level, we can even refine and we can see where are still most antibiotics used, where can we reduce them, so that can help enormously. Another thing that I think is important is allow investment and support for farmers to make structural changes. Because we saw it also in the Living Lab. Some farmers are basically locked into a husbandry system which might not be ideal, but it's very expensive to make these sort of changes. So getting funding for this, for housing, equipment, things like that can help also. And then thirdly, of course, prevention. We have to put more in prevention. If we can prevent diseases, we don't have to treat them. Thank you.
If I may add here something. And basically, speaking of funding, what I would like to, in a way, announce is that the Commission has reserved some 3 million euro to provide hands-on training to veterinarians and farmers on their new obligations under the VMP regulation. So that will basically be addressed. So it will take the form of both in situ and online participation. So the intention is to cover all member states. The target audience is basically farmers and veterinarians working with food-producing animals. The people in the room will be expected to be representatives of local, regional, and national associations or organizations which represent those two main actors in the field of antimicrobial use. It is designed in a way to basically follow the trainer principle. So basically the people who will be trained will be expected to spread further their knowledge, but it will, apart from learning about the new obligations, the intention is also to present the national measures, because our legislation provides for specific measures by the member states to be taken, for instance, to restrict further the use of antimicrobials on their territories if that helps with their national measures to fight antimicrobial resistance. So basically, those people will, as I said, spread the knowledge, hopefully. We will try to also monitor whether that resulted in some behavioral changes of the actors. But the people online will also be like ordinary veterinarians and farmers, which will be able to also hear themselves what their obligations are and what they could do to reduce their antimicrobial use. That call for tenders has been launched recently and is ongoing until the end of May, basically. So that's a QR code for those who are interested in the terms of reference and may want to apply, or just to know that this training is coming. So that's a QR code which you can easily basically use to access the tender specifications. Thank you.
Do you have a question coming from the room? Yes, there is one already.
Thank you. I'm Philip Dorber, Cornwall Dairy Vets in the UK. I'm intrigued with more and more corporate ownership of veterinary practices. Do you foresee there's going to be a reduction in antibiotic usage going forwards because of the potential profitability in the veterinary business? So you've got non-vets who are buying big quantities of medicines at low prices to get a good deal. and they are under pressure to then sell them to farmers. Do we see that as a problem? Or is this a way of a private vet out on practice no longer needing to make so much money from drug sales because they know that a big corporate is going to pay their wages anyway? Am I, as an individual vet, under pressure to sell more drugs, or am I now under pressure to sell less drugs? I'm intrigued to see if you believe that having more corporate ownership, is that making it better in a way to reduce antibiotic use on farm?
The situation regarding corporates buying veterinary practices is very different in the different member states. So in the UK, I think you're now about 50%. But there are countries also in the EU that have almost no corporates yet. The other thing is that most of the corporates, almost all of them, are exclusively in the companion animal sector, probably because it's more profitable. And only very few are active in the farm animal sector. What we see, we have regular contacts with the biggest one of them. For them, antimicrobial resistance is part of what they see their social responsibility duties, so they take it very serious. So I wouldn't expect that it would mean that antibiotic use would go up. On the other hand, I would think, because they have such a strong policies, that it would go down. That having said, I haven't seen any studies yet comparing this prescription on IMU in private normal practice versus corporate practice. But for farm animals, I don't think it will make a big difference because there's not so many corporates yet in the farm practice business. Only in the UK you have a few, what I'm aware of.
So in terms of prescription and sales, again, bringing everything to the VMP regulation, there's rather strict conditions on prescribing antimicrobials and antibiotics in particular. So in a way, that is one of the legal instruments we have at hand to basically limit that problem as much as possible. So basically, all antimicrobials are prescription only. The prescriptions need to be justified. The metaphylactic prescriptions need to be need to follow a prior diagnosis by a vet. There's also the requirement that the prescribed quantities need to match the course of treatment. So there's also legislative measures which have been put in place to limit the issue as much as possible.
Yeah, and looking at it from the side of the pharmaceutical companies, over the last certainly 10 years, probably longer, there has been a shift in where our members make their money. The proportion of profits for the pharmaceutical companies that come from antibiotic sales has been reducing, and the proportion that comes from vaccines and other preventive measures and the smarter technologies has been increasing. And actually that's, I believe, now gone to more than 50%. Is now vaccines against all other forms of therapeutics. So I think we are seeing that move.
Other questions from the room? Yes.
Yeah, thanks a lot for all these interventions, but I have a question about the fundings. Like, you're talking about fundings for education and knowledge, which is really good, but what about the fundings for farmers who are paying a lot to change, for example, for infrastructure, biosecurity measures, alternatives to avoid, to use antibiotics and so. And about this question about the vets, I'm working on the pig and poultry side, and often the vets are paid by drugs and know, it's how to regulate all these things. And I was wondering, do you believe that some rules can be applied as well on the retail chain, or a fixed price for farmers, when they are trying to not use antimicrobials, or for distributors or other person from the chain? because there are always rules for like reduce antimicrobials, you have to reduce, and it's farmers and vets who are like in front of this reducing and who pay like the consequences as well a little bit, I think. And nothing is done like on the bottom of the chain to fix prices or so on.
Anyone want to pick this one? Because I think in that and during, I mean, there are also not just regulation to deal with that issue, but also the market-led initiatives that we mentioned, such as labels and so on. But perhaps or the training part of that question, perhaps for farmers. Do you have any comments?
I mean, I think it's a very complicated question that I don't think it has an easy answer that we may provide at this stage. We were just discussing, Nancy and I, that, yeah, maybe, I mean, right now there are some incentives in the CAP, in the strategic plans, but it's true that depending on the national plan, under the rural development, it can change between member states as well. So it's difficult. And for instance, we already know, talking to, not precisely with the veterinary medicines, but with other units of the Commission in the past, that for certain rules, it's almost impossible to track or to ensure that certain returns of investment come to the farmers or the vets, and it's also, I think, what David was mentioning on the consumer willingness to pay. I mean, there are a lot of factors that actually influence that. Of course, we defend that all the costs that these changes may entail should be appropriately shared and exchanged between the actors, the different actors of the chain. But it's still a pending homework for all of us.
Yeah, I was going to add, I think also with, certainly in terms of large investments in farms, if you're replacing, animal housing and all this sort of thing, which is an expensive thing, you need a certain amount of predictability going forwards. If you want to invest and pay that off over 10 years, you really need to know actually it's still going to be useful in 10 years. And I think one of the issues with farming and veterinary sector at the moment is we are facing a lot of change. Things are moving rapidly, and that makes that prediction about where you invest and how you invest very difficult.
Jonathan Rushton from the University of Liverpool. I just following up on the comment just made, we're looking at public good generation, and we're expecting people to cover the costs of these interventions without actually any kind of recourse if we've got market failure. And I think we have examples here where investments in infrastructure change or management or training probably need a little bit more thought about where's the balance between what we're asking people to do and what's actually being then turned into a public good issue. And across Europe, we are in a situation where we don't tend to pay our vets to actually do these roles. We expect them to do these roles. We expect them to be the gatekeepers of antimicrobials, the watchers of animal welfare. These are public good generation aspects in society. We don't do the same thing with our medics. So our medical profession is relatively well funded in these roles. They are given salaries from the public purse, generally speaking, across Europe. I think we have been very good in Europe in terms of thinking about how we subsidise investments in how animals are kept. We have supported infrastructural changes that relate to better animal husbandry and efficiency, but perhaps there needs to be slightly more thought around how we then employ that if we're thinking about infrastructural change towards antimicrobial use issues. But I'd be interested to know the Commission's view on that particular aspect.
So, as I said earlier, I come from a very separate facet of the issue, and we deal with basically the rules on the use and the authorization of VMPs. So in a way, these questions are probably better addressed at the colleagues at DG Agri, because I think the Common Agricultural Policy is probably one of the instruments to actually support farmers in that transition. But as I said, that is outside my remit. And also, I think in terms of how things are approached from animal health and animal welfare point of view, again, we have dedicated units in DG Sante who work on that. Unfortunately, they're not here, so I cannot speak for them. So in a way, I don't have a straightforward reply to your question.
Yeah, just to add that this question will become even more important, funding or the support for investments, once that the animal welfare legislation will come in September, normally, the draft proposals. So it will be an important one. On the other part of your questions, namely veterinarians getting a large proportion of their income from sales, we have seen that in most countries it has gone down. In some sectors it's hardly anything. But there is still a problem in some countries. And indeed there we need to ensure that we move that that they're paid for their services, not for selling products. And like said earlier already, when you look at the medical profession, often veterinarians are compared to doctors, and you will hardly pay anything for your doctor visits because everything is paid by the state. And then when a veterinarian charges, everybody is like, wow, so much. Yeah, so we have to, this advice has a cost, and this is a sort of cultural change we have to get. And some countries are there already. Like it was earlier said, in Denmark they introduced these regular veterinary visits where you can really promote prevention, which is really a win-win situation, but we have to get that move also going in other countries. Yeah. And it is important because otherwise in some countries we might, in some rural areas, not have any veterinarians left in the future.
Yeah, maybe a very quick thing. I mean, not, of course, as Lubben was mentioning, I mean, not representing the Commission at all and not speaking for them, but I can just transmit you what has been our experience from Copa Cogeca so far in the latest, let's say, dossiers that have more or less tackled this issue. One is the one actually on pesticides, and the second one is the animal welfare that has not yet decided anything on the funding, but as Nancy was mentioning, maybe that will come. And discussing with DG Agri, DG Sante, it depends on who you ask. Of course, there is the mention of the CAP as the tool to help farmers, but on the contrary, there is no budget, not really much budget left for all the initiatives that are trying to pick from the CAP. That's something that DG Agri told us. And from DG Sante, it's the willingness to as well maybe use the CAP, or try to find other ways to fund it, but they are not really defined. And the last thing that I don't know how much it can be applicable to veterinary medicines is to eat less and pay more. So that charges the thing on the consumers. In the end, is the consumer willingness to pay is the big question here. That for the moment is not really resolved. As I said, I think maybe Lubben, correct me if I'm wrong, this as it is already set by regulation 2019-6, it's already implemented, and we know that in the member states, from our members, we know that there is a lot of collaboration between vets and farmers, and there are a lot of national provisions right now that they need to apply. But yeah, the question on funding, I would say, remains still unsolved even after the implementation. Thank you.
And if you're bringing in, talking about advice, it isn't just the veterinarians, although they play an important role. Yeah, we also have to look, as Arno said earlier, your feed advisors. There are some of the governments have farm advisors about systems. And I think those all need to be involved in those discussions on advice on, health on the farm, and the farmer, his stockman, the breeders. And I think that's one, if I dare mention another EU project, the Disarm project was doing a good job in trying to get all those people around the table at the same time to talk to each other and not give different advice to the farmer about what he should do. So I think, that's another thing, is actually to join up all that advice.
Probably stand up because I guess you can't see me from there. Edwin Wouters from ILVO. We have been discussing here about how to motivate, for instance, farmers to move away from their status quo to different practices that reduce the need for antimicrobials. A lot has been on making alternatives more attractive, so funding for investments in new housing, etc., training. But we could also think of complementing that by just trying to make the current status quo less attractive. One example would be taxing inputs that we want to be used less. I take the parallel with the Danish pesticide tax policy, which has had a proven impact on the pesticide use, which has been reduced because of taxing pesticides. But there are other options, doesn't need to be a tax, that could just try to make the current status quo less attractive so that people become automatically more motivated to change. So what does the panel think of that? To try to make just the current status quo less attractive than it is, which would help and reduce probably the efforts we need to do to make the alternative more attractive. Because currently, I mean, farmers are generally not stupid. The current production systems they are in, it's probably because they are the most attractive to them. So to make an alternative more attractive, you would need a lot of training, a lot of motivational talks, and a lot of subsidies probably for investments. But if at the same time we make the status quo a bit less attractive, that could maybe give the additional push.
As the person in Copa-Cogeca responsible as well of the dossier of pesticides, I think I can give a response from our side, not saying that we have a position on the taxation. We know that this has been on the table of the Commission for a long time, and also that we know that, for instance, on pesticides, there was a tentative approach with the member states beginning of 2021 to see if that was actually a feasible method. So far, we know that first, every member state has their national system because it's solely based on national competence. So that's nothing that I feel that the European Union as such can actually put a hand on. Secondly, I don't recall that any agreement actually was reached, and in most of the cases it was like, yeah, it's a system that exists, but it's not really 100% successful. And in many cases, particularly considering the current socio-economic situation, it was seen more as a burden for the producers rather than an incentive. It was more something extra to put on their shoulders, and an impediment as well for them to do their job because they didn't have any alternatives. And I think that can maybe apply as well for animal health. The thing is that, okay, we can commit to make a more targeted or a reduced use of certain products, but as we were saying, what do we have in exchange? Maybe in this case, maybe we have vaccines, or we have better monitoring systems, or prevention, biosecurity. Maybe they are more advanced than in plant health, but we need to always take that into consideration. And I think we should put more, maybe the focus on better investments on research and innovation for industry, research centers, universities, etc., rather on punishing the people that actually use those tools in a daily basis. And plus training, of course, plus telling them, okay, this exists, but maybe you have these alternatives. I mean, training as well, I think, is the other keyword in this discussion. So.
Yeah, I was just going to add something. I think certainly taxing on antibiotics was discussed, certainly early on in the new veterinary legislation. But one of the issues with it was it rapidly got very complicated because it's not an antibiotic or nothing. There are certain antibiotics we would prefer to use in agriculture because they're less important in human medicine. And those tend to be older and cheaper, but the newer ones are less. So it was a lot of complication in how you set this tax up, and in terms of different countries, different diseases are prevalent, so different antibiotics are required to treat those than in others, and trying to set up a system that was fair for everybody and didn't wind up in an absolute administrative nightmare for governments to try and collect taxes proved, I think, very difficult. So I think it was decided in the end to go with, as a colleague here said, in terms of restrictions on, severe restrictions on prophylactic use, restrictions on metaphylactic use, and an encouragement to move away.
It seems to me that in the last decades, Europe has been very successful in improving efficiency of food production. We have been very good at that, and I think if you compare it to other parts of the world, the way how food and food from animal origin is produced in Europe is in a very efficient way. At the moment, we want to make a change from this efficiency to more emphasis on better quality on the product and the way how it is produced. But apparently, we don't manage to sell that change, to get society with us, and we have difficulties to get the real price that should be paid for food. I think at the moment, what consumers pay and what we all pay for the food is even less than what the real price is. A part of the bill for producing food is pushed into the future, and a part is also paid by the conditions where the animals live under. Why can't we change that system? Why can we not better market good quality food and food that is produced in a good way? And if everyone who is in the living labs would say, well, we want to go for that, why don't we manage to make any progress there?
Anyone has really the answer here in the room, but perhaps it relates to one of the questions I had, and I think it was also mentioned earlier in the conversation, but should we or could we or how could we also sometimes like de-zoom a little bit from the sole AMR problem and how to link it with other challenges that is facing contemporary agriculture that has been mentioned even in previous talk, or even David, when you were considering that we have to develop solutions that are compatible to other problems as well, and could be animal welfare, climate change, environmental protection, the sustainability of food system, and so on. And I wonder what you think of that. So it's true that we are an AMR research community. We are really focused on that. But when we go on the field, of course, this is not the only concern of the people we meet, we interview, we're working with in our living labs, and so on. And it is true that it is probably an important lever to be able to integrate more every solution we want to work on AMR with the other concern and issues that people are facing on the ground, and also the society might be facing, such as consumer demand and so on. So I wonder whether you, with your organization and things like that, this is something you have in mind, and which tools you might be thinking of when about de-zooming and enlarging the AMR problem and connecting it with other issues and basically perhaps reconnecting the issue of how to change agriculture as a whole towards something better, and not just thinking about the AMU issue.
I think we have to look in a holistic way, because that's the only way forward. And if we just take the pig sector as an example, the pig sector, we're trying to reduce antibiotic use. At the same time, we have African swine fever. We have the climate issues. We have the zinc oxide. So there's so many issues. We have a warming climate also, so we have problems with too much heat in stables. So we have so many issues together that we cannot look at them solely. Now, the good thing is some of them, interventions we can take are synergistic, and that's very, very positive. I always remember I went to a meeting in Ireland, which was with pig farmers that stopped tail docking, and the whole meeting was about stopping tail docking. But what came back in every presentation that they made the farmers that succeeded was that they almost used no antibiotics also. So we really saw their animal welfare measures and antibiotic use was synergistic. But in other things, they're not synergistic. And there are trade-offs if we look at the environment and animal health issues. So, and animal welfare. So we will have to look at that and see how we can move forward and help the sector to make this way forward. And also doing it in a predictable way, because that's what was earlier said. You have to know where you want to go. And not get different policies contradicting each other.
Yeah, and
sorry.
No, I wanted just to add to what Nancy was mentioning, that actually on that, I think it's one of the things that is very important for achieving these objectives is that one advantage, again, that I would say we have in animal health opposite to plant health is that we have veterinarians. We have veterinarians that come to the farms, and most of them know the farm, know the farmer, know the animals, and they monitor and they have systems to actually make some forecast and apply more prevention and recommend some systems. I will point one out, I think that is very crucial, and it's not so much discussed, that is biosecurity. That I think right now in many of the discussions that we are having in the context of the Farm to Fork, for instance, for environment, for animal health, animal welfare, etc., I think that is very important to take into consideration on how biosecurity works in benefit of all of that. And particularly when we are talking about extensive systems, I think those have the biggest challenges right now in terms of biosecurity, and particularly for certain diseases like African swine fever, avian influenza, even tuberculosis, etc. I mean, external biosecurity is right now a pending subject in many places, and that maybe can be a tool as well to achieve other objectives of other legislations and see. But as Nancy was mentioning, it's a really multifactorial issue that needs to be seen with all the pros and cons and also the trade-offs that it can generate if it's not carefully assessed. That's all I would like to say. Thank you.
And if I can somehow try and reply to the de-zooming and then zooming back, because all these issues are interrelated. Animal health and welfare basically reflect on, in the end, on the use of VMPs, antimicrobials in particular. But de-zooming, you can see that the Commission, for instance, has taken the very big and ambitious step of the Green Deal, but then it all breaks down into different aspects, such as, for instance, the Farm and Fork strategy, where pesticides are there. There's targets to reduce their use as well. There's the antimicrobial use. So in a way, the overall EU policy goes in a certain direction. And then, of course, there's the sectorial elements which get broken down again and de-zoomed and then need to be implemented on the ground. But on the other hand, you shouldn't lose the trees for the forest. So basically, they all fit together. So there's, as was mentioned today, there's no like silver bullet. So everything needs to come together. And that's what the Commission overall is doing, basically by giving the overall direction and then giving the more specific and sectorial elements to it.
Thanks. I completely agree with this big vision with one welfare, one health, but I just wanted to come back to two things, like about the food chain and about my first intervention. I agree, like the consumers has to big point, and it's not easy to. But all the taxes that we could do for the right price, distributors, which are taking a lot of profit between farmers and consumer as well. And my second. Hello. Yeah. Of course, I'm relieved that it was not the solution taking like into account, because I completely disagree. And I think we have some alternatives. We talk about that. security measure. We have some feed alternatives. We have like phytotherapy and aromatherapy. And I have a question about this because I don't know for other countries, but for example, in France, there is no rules to prescribe phytotherapy or aromatherapy, and everyone can buy it like on supermarket, on internet, and they don't know the synergies, but they don't know like the antagonism of some of them, and we have a lot of intoxication and stuff. And I was wondering like if there is some issues about this problematic of phytotherapy, aromatherapy should be like only for vets and doctors to be prescribed, or do you have like other things going on this?
I mean, it's an interesting area, and I know there are discussions in France about regulating it, but it also depends on what you're talking about, because we have rules for herbal medicines in Europe where you do purification, extract, and then produce a product which you can test for efficacy and quality and safety. But I think you also have this market where you feed, plants directly to the animals for a benefit, and there it is much more difficult because it's very difficult to assess what you're actually giving them, because we all know different plants grown under different conditions will contain different amounts of the active, and so in terms of actually showing its effectiveness and safety and things, I think it's a very difficult area to regulate and to try and maintain. So.
Yeah, it's an important one, and it's like David John says, a very difficult one. So in EMA, there has also been the European Medicines Agency, some reflections on how can, for example, fakes, which can really be beneficial, but how can they be regulated, or probiotics or immunostimulants, things like that. But it's very, very difficult to put a regulatory framework on it. One other issue that we really have is in Europe we have two mechanisms for authorizing medicines. One is a centralized mechanism where you have a license for the whole of the EU, and the other is a national where it goes. And with the result of that is that in some countries you have a lot of medicines and alternatives to antimicrobials on the market, and you have some countries where there's hardly anything, and who, for example, do not have narrow-spectrum antibiotics for certain species. So veterinarians have to prescribe narrow-spectrum antibiotics, but then you don't have them on the market, so how can you prescribe them? Yes, really. Yeah, UPD, but you have to be able to import them, which is really difficult. Vaccines is another problem. So some countries have really good vaccines, but then other countries really have none authorized on their market and have really difficulties to import them. So we don't have a single market yet.
So in terms of herbal medicines, unlike the human side, which have specific rules for simplified procedures for their authorization, we don't have that, so they need to go through the normal process, like demonstrating quality, safety, and efficacy, like every other medicine for animals. But the issues and the challenges have been outlined quite well. But just to let you know that by 2027, the Commission should come up with a report on herbal medicines, and it may or may not, as a disclaimer, be accompanied, not necessarily together with the report, but by further legislative action to somehow see whether it's possible to simplify the registration, like something similar, I guess, to homeopathics, but that's down the line, so it's not on the table yet.
I just want to bring the perspective of feed side, because we are talking about phytotherapy, but we have also some plants which are not medicines, but which also can provide benefit and help the animal to cope with pathogen, as we say. So there is a framework, a feed additive legislation. And then you have to maybe distinguish the two things. One is safety. We have a lot of essential oils are today authorized as feed additive, but not for the purpose of helping animals to cope with pathogen. But at least their safety is assessed. Then when it comes to the efficacy, that's another question. But at least you can, if your concern is safety, at least that way you can address part of the problem. That's one aspect. The second aspect is for the synergies between all the kind of challenges that we have to face. There may be also virtual circles. If I just take the example of proteins, proteins is potentially a problem for piglets. It is a problem for the environment. It is a problem because of nitrates, ammonia. It is a problem because of dependency on Amazonian forests and so on. But we could also see that when you reduce the protein amount in feed, it does not automatically translate into a decrease in livestock performance. So there is not always a cost associated to a technique, and it can be even more let's say beneficial if the same solution can address several problems at the same time. And this may not be, let's say, sufficiently disseminated as information. I just take the example of Denmark, where they made a lot of studies on that because of zinc oxide. And that was really beneficial to learn more about how to win piglets in conditions that do not translate automatically in losing performance.
First go here. Thank you. I would like to shortly come back on the topic of trade-offs, because it's a term that we've heard quite sometimes during this discussion. And of course, there are trade-offs between different topics. But I would like to stress or to focus a bit on also the common features of it, because a lot of the issues that we have in animal husbandry, for example, antimicrobial resistance, emissions, animal welfare problems, or public health issues, they are all related to the fact that we keep animals in such an intensive way. And then I would like to come back to what was said previously, that how do we make sure that we focus on the solution really on the larger scale that is related to this intensive system, rather than get stuck in the trade-offs that might or might not be solvable. What do you think about that?
Well, you tackle a hotspot, no doubt. But I think I will be very blunt on this, I think there is a very huge misconception about intensive farming. Sorry to say. Secondly, as we were saying, well, first of all, we have always defended that following all that we have discussed about the evolution of farming, at least in the EU, I can say that we respect the law, and we know that the law is quite tight, but we have done our best to already apply it, and we know that the animal welfare legislation will be probably tighter and go further, and we are ready to try to tackle that in the right time and with the right resources. But I mean, we all hear these mentions of intensive farming like it's the devil. But one of the things, for instance, that we can see in intensive farming is that they have high levels of biosecurity. Not always 100% effective depending on the farm, and that's another thing that I need to stress again. Every rule that is implemented needs to be adapted to farm realities, and every farm needs a tailor-made solution, because not even neighbor farms are the same of the other. But we need to consider that this, on biosecurity at least, on animal health protection, in many cases, it's a good standard. We can, of course, discuss for several, apologies. Yeah, sorry. We can discuss about densities, of course, and this is something that the legislation is currently tackling, how dense or not, maybe in some cases, there could be more densities. I think that's already tackled in the legislation, but maybe, yeah, of course, as it is from 20 years ago, it needs to be updated. We can agree on that and see how feasible it will be, because that will require as well, as we were mentioning, changes of infrastructure, investments. So that's, everything is very related in the same big picture, as we were saying, de-zooming from the one aspect. I mean, everything is actually interlinked. I wouldn't put aside the trade-offs, for sure, because there will be trade-offs in one side or another. I mean, some things that can be considered right now from the theory, good for the environment, maybe not be so good, let's say, in terms of, I don't know, maybe going back to what Arnaud was mentioning on the nitrates and how the excretions, for instance, from intensive animals like poultry and pigs are actually managed and collected in some safe places not to contaminate the environment or the soil. If they go outdoors, maybe there will be more chances that they will contaminate directly the soil, because they will be directly nitrogen on the soil. Is that really good for the environment? That's what needs to be really carefully assessed. So I think we need to go away, being, again, really blunt, from simplistic assumptions and consider that every system has its pros and cons. And we need actually very good knowledge. And I think that's also following what Jan, I think, was mentioning. That is something, pending subject for us, to how to actually communicate the best practices that we are applying in all productive systems: organic, semi-extensive, semi-intensive, intensive, extensive. I mean, we have a lot of systems. We have 27 member states that we need to take care about. They have different conditions, different weathers, different production systems, different cultures, different traditions, and we need to respect them all. So I think, yeah, we need to be very careful on this kind of assessment. Thank you.
Yeah. Is it working? Yeah. Well, I must say, if I understand you correctly, the statement you make is that biosecurity is better on intensive farms. Well, I cannot disagree, because I think that is true. But I also hear you say, again, the trade-off for when we put animals outdoors, that there will be more emissions. Sure, that's also a fact, because then we have to think about how to reduce those emissions by separation of urine and manure, or make them defecate in specific areas to prevent the emissions. But still, I think this is related to the amount of animals we keep, because if we try to stay within the thresholds of the ecologic system that we live in, then emissions per se don't have to be a problem. So we can have emissions in an area, but it should be suitable for the amount of deposition that can be taken up by the environment. So I still feel that we are, again, focusing on trade-offs that might not necessarily be the ones that we should focus on.
Just to mention, it's something that we just need to be aware of, just to avoid worse problems in certain cases that may come unexpectedly. But I mean, I can agree that, of course, from every angle, we need to take careful consideration for everything. I mean, I think that's the general approach. We can maybe agree on certain things, but as I said, this is a debate probably for another 2-3 hours in another occasion.
Absolutely, and thank you anyway for these points that also are good to be debated. Let's go to perhaps the last question of Luca. I don't know if there was any other, but if we would like to.
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, please.
Luca Guardabassi, University of Copenhagen. I'm not an economist, I'm not a sociologist, I'm a microbiologist, but I've been in the AMR business as a researcher for 27 years. And I've seen a lot of changes in the EU, and quite successful changes. So I would like to congratulate actually all the stakeholders present here for what we have done as Europe. So we have dropped down dramatically the use of antimicrobials, which was already pretty low in some countries like Denmark, where I live and work. And now we are seeing some of the countries that were consuming a lot of antibiotics, like Italy, the country where I was born, or Spain, aligning to a similar trend. So I have a question and a comment. The question is, what is the goal here? What is the political goal? Do we want to have an antibiotic-free production in Europe? Or we want maybe to reach the goal that has been already achieved in some countries like Denmark? Because this is quite important to know. And the comment which is about antibiotic-free production, I have to support some of the other comments that were made before, in particular by the former FVE president, Jan Warten. I mean, we need really to rethink the system without focus on antimicrobial use and more attention to animal welfare. Because when I go to the supermarket and see that the price of a chicken is comparable to the price of a bottle of Coca-Cola, I get a little bit disgusted, because thinking what is behind the production of a chicken and what is behind the production of a bottle of Coke is quite different, isn't it? And what to do, that the comment by Jan ended with this question that nobody actually answered, what to do. We have an animal welfare legislation on the way. I would expect that something is done there, for example. It's not only a matter of density. The way we produce pigs, for example, the natural weaning of a pig is 3-4 months, and we wean them at 3-4 weeks. So maybe we have to, and most of the diseases are actually occurring at that stage, because the animals are very stressed. And there is no vaccine that can prevent that disease. They are opportunistic pathogens. So let's not expect biosecurity measures or vaccines, new vaccines, to solve the problem. If we want to solve the problem, we have to reduce the weaning time. And just a small thing, it was a long comment, but I think it's an interesting one. As we were successful in raising awareness about AMR and AMU, I think we could be successful in convincing the consumers that they have to pay more for the meat they eat. And many of the diseases in human medicine we have today, obesity and many others, are due to an excess of food, an excess of proteins. We are hearing from the feed industry that actually we can produce more healthy pigs by using less proteins. So let's stop also this mantra that we need more proteins. Maybe we need to consume less proteins and have a more sustainable production, not only in pig production, but also in other sector of livestock production. Sorry for the long comment.
Well, if I'll start with the first part. You know, where are we? What's the target? And I think it's a good question. We have a lot of targets in the EU that you could look at. We have the farm to fork 50% reduction. You go back a little further, we had the Lord O'Neill's report, which gave this 50 milligrams per PCU figure as a potential target. But I think, realistically, I think what we're looking at is removing unnecessary use. And I think that's probably something we could all agree on. The question then comes, what is unnecessary use? And I think that's where the problem comes, and I suspect that is going to be a moving target. You know, for instance, Denmark at the moment probably has removed most unnecessary use with current, but with technology, well, possibly not, but you're certainly the closest, shall we say. But I think then if you get technological advances or advances in husbandry that we're not currently aware of, actually what is today necessary, tomorrow may be unnecessary. And so I think that's also got to be factored into that. So I think, so to answer the question, I don't think it's unnecessary use, whatever that may be.
I'm afraid I don't have much more to add, because indeed, the overall, I mean, we now have this target of 50% reduction of sales by 2030, but the overall objective indeed is removing unnecessary use and basically sticking to prudent and responsible use. And as was said, like developments in science, in technology, will hopefully render some of the use which is currently necessary, unnecessary in the future. So there is a way to progress, and hopefully that will be soon. Probably not by 2030, because that's too soon, but indeed some of the countries have made a lot of effort over the years. They have demonstrated significant reductions in the sales and consumption of antimicrobials, but there's still room for other countries to do so, and probably some of the best performers can still look into what may be unnecessary use. Thank you.
Yeah, just as very last, indeed, I think we can, first of all, we have to see what has been done already, and we can be really proud on that. And I'm convinced that we will reduce further, especially now with the new legislation, the starting of the monitoring of use data. So we're on the right way. I think the initial idea, and the idea still is, goal is to reduce antimicrobial resistance. Now, in the meantime, we've seen that even while we reduced a lot on the animal side, to get antimicrobial resistance down, it's not so easy. So we see it going down on the animal side, but only a very little bit. But on the human side, we still see that resistance is going up. And so there, again, the One Health approach comes in. We cannot do this alone, even if I always say, even if we stop using all antibiotics for animals, if nothing is done on the human side, they will still have the same problem. So it has to be a joint approach. On the other issue, I think indeed it's a very important one. Where do we want to go to? I think as veterinarians, we want to give animals a good life, a good quality of life. That's our aim, a life worth living, like it says. And that means that we have to adapt the system to the animal and not the animal to the system, which in some cases maybe we have been doing in the past. So we have to move there, but we cannot, it will be an evolution, not a revolution. We have to do it step by step because in the end, the consumer has to pay, and then there's the question. And we have also the imports from third countries. So we want to keep our farmers in Europe. So it's, yeah, it has to be a step-by-step approach. And just taking the weaning part, indeed, where do we see most of antibiotics used? It's mixing, weaning, young animals. So these are the things we really have to target on. But the natural weaning of pigs is 20 weeks. We cannot move from 4 to 20 weeks, but maybe we can move to 5 weeks. Maybe that could be a benefit. So this is scientific research that has to be done and see where we can make the most efforts.